December 1941. The snow did not simply fall from the sky, it carved through flesh like thousands of frozen blades. Across the endless white plains outside Moscow stood exhausted soldiers who only months earlier had believed victory was already within their grasp. They had stared toward the distant outlines of the Kremlin towers and imagined they could almost touch them. But now those towers looked unreal, like a mirage hanging beyond the horizon, a reminder that there were things impossible to conquer in a land where even nature itself fought back. Beneath Wehrmacht boots, the frozen earth cracked sharply with every step. Uniforms soaked by sleet and rain had frozen stiff like armor plates. Every breath turned instantly into ice. The temperature fell to -30, then lower still. Men who had known only the winters of Germany and France now marched through a country that rejected them with every gust of frozen wind. Master mechanic Hans Lemke wrote in his diary, "Our tanks refuse to start. The oil inside the engines has frozen solid like metal. The guns jam. Men sleep standing because the cold penetrates through every layer of clothing. We fear the winter more than the Russians." It was the first moment the German army truly understood that the Soviet Union possessed an ally no weapon could destroy, winter itself. Only months earlier everything had seemed certain. In June 1941 Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million soldiers crossed into Soviet territory supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler believed the campaign would end before the first snowfall. "We will take Moscow before winter arrives," he promised confidently. At first the war appeared to unfold exactly as planned. Minsk collapsed within days. Smolensk followed soon after. Kiev fell in September. German armored divisions smashed through Soviet defenses with terrifying speed, surrounding entire armies and driving deeper eastward. Hitler stood over maps where Soviet lines shattered one after another and whispered, "They will never recover. Moscow already belongs to us." But maps could not show distance. They could not show time. And they could not show cold. The attack on Moscow began in October under the name Operation Typhoon. The title sounded unstoppable, like a force of nature meant to destroy everything in its path. German soldiers believed this final offensive would end the war once and for all. Columns rolled toward the Soviet capital across roads drowned in endless mud. Rain fell for weeks without pause. Tanks sank into the earth. Horses collapsed in marshes. Before the frost even arrived, the roads had already become hell. Sergeant Walter Vogel later remembered, "We dragged our artillery ourselves. The wheels disappeared into the mud up to the axle. Men fell face first into the filth, stood up again, and kept pulling. Back then we thought the mud was the worst thing imaginable. We had no idea what was waiting ahead. What waited ahead was snow, endless, merciless snow." By late November 1941 German forces stood less than 30 kilometers from Moscow. Through binoculars soldiers could see church domes shining faintly beneath pale sunlight. German radio broadcasts confidently declared, "Moscow will be ours by Christmas." But winter arrived not as celebration, but as punishment. The first severe frosts paralyzed vehicles, tanks, and artillery pieces. Soldiers froze alive inside trenches. Hundreds suffered frostbite every single day. Bread became so hard it had to be hacked apart with axes. Gun oil thickened until rifles refused to fire. Officers searched desperately for wood to light fires, but there was almost nothing left to burn. Greatcoats froze solid overnight. Men who fell asleep in the open snow often never woke again. The Soviet soldiers suffered too, but they possessed something the Germans lacked: experience. They understood winter. They knew survival depended on felt boots, fur hats, warm stoves, and layers of wool. While German troops wrapped themselves in thin coats and blankets, Soviet soldiers wore sheepskin jackets, scarves, and handmade gloves. Their logic was brutally simple. If you freeze, you die. If you stay warm, you can still fight. Then the Siberian divisions arrived. Transferred west after Soviet intelligence confirmed Japan would not attack from the east, these soldiers came from a world where winter ruled everything. Their faces were burned by frost and hidden beneath white camouflage suits. German troops soon began calling them the ghosts of winter. They emerged silently from blizzards, attacked without warning, and disappeared again into the snow. Meanwhile, Hitler remained inside heated headquarters issuing impossible commands. He demanded the advance continue no matter the cost, although many of his generals already understood disaster was approaching. General Heinz Guderian reported. The machinery no longer functions. Roads are frozen solid. Men are dying from cold. We lose more soldiers to frost than enemy fire. Hitler answered with only one phrase. No excuses. Moscow must fall. Those words would condemn tens of thousands. Inside Moscow, the city prepared for a final defense. Bombs exploded overhead day and night. Workers dug anti-tank trenches through frozen streets. Steel barricades appeared across roads. Schoolchildren carried sandbags. University students climbed rooftops to extinguish incendiary bombs. Young women assembled artillery shells in freezing factories while their gloves stuck to the metal. Across Soviet radio came the voice of Levitan. Moscow is ready to meet the enemy. We will never surrender the capital. Those words stopped sounding like propaganda. They became a promise. At the end of November, the German assault resumed. Tanks crawled through snowdrifts rising to soldiers' knees. Men pushed vehicles by hand. Fuel supplies disappeared. Horses collapsed in the roads. Entire machines were abandoned beneath layers of ice. One German soldier, Karl Schmidt, wrote home. We saw Moscow today. The domes glittered beneath the sun. But the sun here gives no warmth. It lies. Everything is white and lifeless, and I feel myself slowly becoming ice. Those lines captured the despair spreading through an army once convinced it could never be defeated. The Soviet forces, meanwhile, prepared to strike back. They knew the enemy had weakened. Now the cold itself had become their ally. Soldier Ivan Elizarov later recalled. We stood waist-deep in snow, but beneath us the earth still felt alive. Moscow stood behind us, and ahead were men already freezing to death. Let the frost fight beside us. During those terrible days, what history would later call the miracle of Moscow began to take shape. Nature itself seemed to rise in defense of the city. Frost spared nobody. It judged conquerors and defenders alike. Snow swallowed blood, screams, and footprints. Endless white buried horrors later remembered simply as the winter of 41. But for those who survived, it became far more than a season. It proved spirit could outlast steel, and that only a burning heart could overcome deadly cold. While German soldiers wrapped newspapers around their feet and huddled beside dying fires, Soviet troops in heavy sheepskin coats marched silently into the blizzard. And slowly, across that frozen land, one truth became impossible to deny. Victory there would not belong to the side with more tanks. It would belong to those capable of surviving Moscow's deadly snow. By mid-December the frost itself felt alive. It crept beneath coats and into trenches like invisible smoke. It killed without bullets, without screams, without warning. Breath crystallized instantly. Eyelashes froze together. Rifles stuck to bare skin. Men breathing through open mouths felt icy air slash into their lungs like broken glass. Horses collapsed frozen in motion like statues carved from stone. The Wehrmacht no longer dreamed about taking Moscow. Soldiers thought only about warmth, dry socks, and bread that did not require an axe to cut. One German battalion reported. More than 5% of personnel suffer severe frostbite. Soldiers lose fingers, hearing, consciousness. Machine gun oil freezes. Vehicles fail to start. Horses are dead. Inside Hitler's headquarters, those reports were dismissed as cowardice. If you lack fuel, Hitler told Guderian, replace it with courage. But courage could not warm frozen hands. German soldier Friedrich Kramer wrote home. Mother, I cannot feel my hands anymore. We sleep standing. Snow falls directly into our faces. Our sergeant died during the night. He simply sat down and froze. We buried him in the snow this morning, and immediately afterward came orders to attack again. The soldiers advanced not because they still believed in victory, but because standing still meant death. And so began the second phase of the nightmare outside Moscow, an offensive carried forward by men already half dead. Inside Soviet lines, however, snow became protection. It concealed movement, muffled footsteps, and hid positions from aircraft. In frozen trenches outside the city sat soldiers dressed completely in white camouflage. These were the Siberian divisions Stalin had transferred westward after learning Japan would not strike from the east. They arrived like spirits from the taiga, silent, hardened men who did not fear winter. They wore fur gloves, felt boots, and heavy sheepskin coats. They knew how to survive at temperatures reaching 50 below zero. Soldier Nikolai Chernov later remembered. When they told us the Germans were freezing, we laughed. For us it felt like an ordinary winter day. The Siberians built makeshift stoves from metal cans, dug shelters beneath the snow, ate frozen potatoes and salted pork fat, and drank boiling water beside fires that barely gave light. We didn't need sunlight, Chernov said. The snow itself protected us. For the Germans, that same snow became a curse. Infantry struggled blindly through drifts. Tanks froze where they stood. Prisoners later admitted German soldiers stripped fur hats from dead Soviet troops not for trophies, but simply to survive. They wrapped their feet in newspapers. Stuffed straw beneath uniforms. Bound their hands in rags. Nothing stopped the cold. Death comes silently here, one officer wrote. You sit down, close your eyes, and disappear. Yet inside Soviet dugouts songs could still be heard, rough, exhausted voices trembling in darkness. Soldiers sang to stay awake, to stay warm, to drown out the screams carried by the wind. Sergeant Alexei Petrov once said, when everything around you freezes, a song becomes fire. As long as we sing, we are alive. Winter showed no mercy. But while it became executioner for one side, it turned into an ally for the other. Snow transformed into a battlefield where nature and man fought together. At the same time, the Siberian divisions prepared for attack. They knew the enemy had weakened and that the moment to strike had come. General Georgy Zhukov organized the counteroffensive carefully. He understood this was more than an opportunity to stop the Germans. It was a chance to change the entire course of the war. The Germans are not accustomed to defeat, Zhukov said before the assault. But they do not understand winter near Moscow. Then, on December 5, the blizzard arrived. Snowstorms swallowed sky and earth alike. Front lines disappeared completely. German soldiers could no longer tell where the attack originated. Because it came from everywhere. Snow. Wind. Artillery. Screams. Everything merged into one endless roaring storm. Inside the chaos, Soviet soldiers dressed in white looked less like men and more like spirits emerging from the blizzard itself. German officer Paul Bachner later wrote, they emerged from the white darkness. We heard no footsteps. Only saw our men falling. The snow itself was firing at us. It was the beginning of the judgment of General Frost. The ground shook as hundreds of Soviet artillery guns opened fire simultaneously. Explosions ripped apart the frozen earth. Snow burst upward together with mud, bodies, and shattered wood. Through the white smoke came Soviet tanks crawling across the battlefield like iron beasts covered in ice. Soldiers rode atop the armor wrapped in blankets and frost-covered coats. Their faces were pale from cold, but their eyes burned with determination. "Yura!" they screamed as they advanced. That cry tore through the blizzard louder than artillery itself. Infantryman Semyon Kravtsov later remembered. The snow looked white, but after the battle it seemed red. Blood disappeared into it instantly. German units attempted to hold their positions, but many soldiers could not even understand where the attack was coming from. In the white storm there was no horizon, no sky, no earth. "We saw only snow," one German lieutenant recalled. Then shadows moved through it, and seconds later men around us were dead. Entire command posts vanished beneath artillery fire. One German headquarters was destroyed during lunch when a shell exploded through the window and struck the stove inside. The blast scattered maps, plates, and bodies across the room. Afterward, snow drifted slowly through the broken walls, covering everything in silence. Winter itself seemed to close the eyes of the defeated. Meanwhile, Soviet troops kept advancing. Snow did not hinder them, it protected them. They knew where to hide, where to move, where to fire. Every frozen step felt familiar. Near Volokholamsk, one Soviet commander shouted to his men, "Do not fear. We are home." Those words echoed louder than any order. Behind German lines, communication collapsed. Telephone wires snapped. Radios failed. Maps became outdated faster than officers could redraw them. The entire front began to break apart like a collapsing wall. German generals wrote reports describing Soviet soldiers as possessing inhuman endurance. But it was not inhuman. It was survival. Strange stories spread across the battlefield during those days. Soldiers whispered about men rising alive from beneath snow after being declared dead. Others spoke of fighters with frozen hands continuing to fire rifles using only their elbows. In the endless white storm, reality itself began to feel unreal. The German retreat started slowly, then turned into panic. Abandoned tanks. Frozen artillery. Dead horses. Wagons buried beneath snow. Roads became lined with bodies and wreckage disappearing beneath fresh drifts. "We retreat," wrote Unteroffizier Fritz Müller, "but the snow moves faster than we do." Still the Soviet troops advanced. They marched without sleep. They ate snow and drank melted ice water. Many could no longer feel their feet. Yet almost nobody complained. Because now it was no longer simply battle. It was vengeance. Among the advancing Soviet forces was a medic named Anna Rubtsova. She dragged wounded soldiers from snowdrifts, burning vehicles, and artillery craters. One evening she found a wounded German soldier lying half-buried in snow. Blood stained the ice beneath him. He could no longer speak. Anna covered him with her own blanket and stayed beside him until he died. "He is still human," she told nearby soldiers when they asked why she helped him. "The frost does not choose who deserves mercy." Those words later spread through military hospitals across the front. By mid-December the Soviet counteroffensive became unstoppable. German lines collapsed across hundreds of kilometers. Thousands of prisoners were taken. Entire territories once conquered by the Wehrmacht were recaptured. It was the first great defeat of Hitler's army. Inside his headquarters Hitler raged furiously. He shouted at his generals and blamed everyone except himself. "This is not defeat," he screamed. "It is temporary." But deep inside even he understood something impossible had happened. Moscow had survived. Zhukov later said, "We did not simply defend Moscow. We proved they could be defeated." Those words became prophecy. Still the snow continued falling. It covered the living and the dead alike. It buried tanks, ruins, footprints, and blood. The frost that once brought fear had become a symbol of survival. One Soviet soldier wrote to his wife, "Yesterday this snow meant death. Today it feels like the road home. January eventually replaced December. The cold remained brutal, but the sound of artillery grew more distant. Wind still swept snow across the battlefields where thousands had died only weeks before. Now the snow resembled not an enemy, but a shroud spread across a wounded land. Burned villages stood silent beneath the frost. Blackened chimney pipes rose from ruins like gravestones. Civilians slowly returned along frozen roads scattered with shell fragments and bodies buried beneath ice. Here was battle, people whispered. Here was winter. And here remained those who never lived to see spring. Moscow still stood. The city predicted to fall had survived. The snow that was supposed to symbolize destruction had become a symbol of victory. On January 6, 1942, Levitan announced over Soviet radio that German forces near Moscow had suffered catastrophic defeat. Across the city people cried, not from joy, but from exhaustion and disbelief that they were still alive. We endured, people said. We froze, but we did not break. Frozen soldiers marched through Moscow streets wrapped in ice-covered coats. Their faces looked gray from cold and hunger, yet their eyes remained alive. Women handed them hot tea and bread. Strangers embraced them like family. You saved the capital, civilians told them. No, many soldiers answered quietly. Winter saved us. General Zhukov stood over maps now covered with arrows pointing west instead of toward Moscow. This is not the end, he said. But it is the beginning of their end. For Germany, the defeat near Moscow became impossible to explain away. They had not merely lost to an army. They had lost to distance, winter, and a people unwilling to surrender. General Halder later admitted. We underestimated them. They do not wage war the way we do. They live through it. Thousands of German bodies remained frozen outside Moscow, trapped forever in poses of movement, as though still trying to march forward. They never reached the Kremlin. They never reached Christmas. Many never reached home again. And above them all stretched endless silence, white, frozen, eternal silence, where the snow seemed to whisper only one word. Moscow.